Hello, U.S. history students. Good to see you again. It's Monday night, May 11th, and this could be, I think it is, our last video, our YouTube video. Now, I see some tears out there. I'm planning on having a Zoom class for our last class, but stay tuned to that, which I will inform you of by email. But for now, we have a quiz. U.S. History, Chapter 24, The New Frontier and the Great Society. Number 1 comes from number 2 on your homework. What factor may have made the difference in the election results by helping Kennedy? Number 2 comes from number 9. In all 3 court cases mentioned in the extending due process section, I think there are actually 4 court cases mentioned there, what persons was the court speaking up for who previously had had their rights limited? Number 3 is from number 15 on your homework. By the end of the 1960s, how had the U.S., quote-unquote, won the space race? Number 4 is from number 21. Johnson's government programs might be compared to what earlier 20th century presidents? Number 5 is from number 30. What might have hindered Johnson's Great Society goals? And number 6, extra credit, comes from number 32. What is a question that Johnson's presidency produced about the role of government? And that is your quiz. So let's talk about John Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson. President Kennedy took over in 1961, won the election in 1960, took over after 8 years of Eisenhower. So we're transferring power from the Republicans to the Democrats. Although, as your text said, at least initially, and especially during the campaign, it didn't seem like Kennedy differed that much from what Eisenhower and the Republicans had been doing up to that point in time. He was mostly a cold warrior, as was his opponent in the election, and he promised to expand the economy, being a little bit elusive about exactly how we would do that. Anyway, that 1960 election was against none other than Richard Milhous Nixon, who would later win the presidency. He would have to wait another 8 years. He'd win the 1968 election and then the 1972 election, but did not serve out his full term because of the Watergate scandal. He's the only president to have resigned the presidency. Well, back in 1960, he was, and he was running for president for the Republicans. He had been Dwight Eisenhower's vice president. And your text also said some of the remarkable things about this campaign was the importance that the media took in the campaign, especially the first televised debates. There were 4 of them, and whenever anyone speaks of them, they always talk about the contrast between Kennedy and Nixon. Nixon being rather stiff and uptight and looking tired and rather pale, and on the other side, young, handsome, vibrant, charismatic is a word often associated with his Democratic rival, John Kennedy. And many people say that it was Kennedy's performance and just the image that he conveyed of confidence and of optimism and of charisma, remember that word, that he really won the debates, even though perhaps no one remembers the actual words spoken. They just remember the image that was conveyed. Also, it's the first election where there were millions and millions and millions of dollars, even in those days, which was a large sum of money, spent on television and radio ads. The only 2 media really available to candidates. But as Eric Severide, a reporter of the time, said, in your textbook said, that now we had packaged candidates. This would become more and more true as we moved throughout the 20th century and even today. What else did I want to say? Well, Kennedy won, and even though we've had a lot closer elections electorally, and of course, um, just popular vote since then, it was considered a very close election. It was 303 to 219 in the Electoral College, and he won by about 120,000 votes or 119,000 votes. Um, at his inaugural address, he famously said, I guess the the best one line that he said throughout his presidency, which is, and you should know this because it's often quoted, ask not what your country can do for you. Let's see if I can get it right. But what you can do for your country. Um, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Yeah, that's how famous it is. It just rolled off my lips. But it's interesting that this came from a Democratic president because Democrats were and are liable to being criticized for wanting the government to do more for people. So he tried to sort of twist that image a little bit by saying, ask not what your government can do for you, but what you can do for your government. Anyway, his program, which I think he laid out in his inaugural address and thereafter, was called the New Frontier. It wasn't that new because he continued many of things that had been started by earlier administrations. He wanted improved aid to education. He did want health insurance for the elderly. That's an important thing. And he wanted a greater part of his bureaucracy to include some representative for urban affairs, for people who would look specifically at the problems that cities had. Um, Democrats had the majority in both houses, in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And unfortunately, Kennedy um, could not deliver on much of his legislative programs, which is a little surprising. If you are a Democratic president and the House of Representatives has a Democratic majority and the Senate has a Democratic majority, you have a situation where you should be able to create a legislative package, or many of them, and they should be able to make it through Congress and into law. Well, this wasn't the case. People who are sort of Kennedy cynics, and I'm not saying they're not right, said that Kennedy didn't have even though he had the charisma, he did not have the ability to create consensus and the ability to concede things and just the ability to, for lack of a better term, schmooze with people enough to get a consensus that gained a majority for his programs. Other people would cite, as your textbook does, that the Democratic Party was sort of moving apart within itself. There were more liberal Democrats and there were many conservative Democrats, soon to break away to go to the Republican Party, many of whom were in the South, so-called Dixiecrats, who didn't necessarily like the aggressive liberal agendas of many previous Democratic presidents. So that was a problem. I think both of these can be cited for reasons why Kennedy had difficulty in getting his agenda passed. He also had some bad times with the business community, and you don't want to do this because they're a strong part of the voting bloc and an important constituency within the United States, and that is, well, as I said, the business industry. In industry, I'm not speaking very well, am I? And that came about because of an incident with the steel industry where he convinced labor unions to hold down their demands for wage increases. But soon after that, the price of steel actually still went up. And so he thought that they were fixing prices and wanted the Justice Department to investigate, and even threatened to go and buy steel not from U.S. companies, that is the federal government, to buy steel from foreign companies as opposed to U.S. companies. Not a very smart political move as the president, okay? Not the best way to get people on your side or to get them to do what you want to do. I'm going to go buy steel from China. Anyway, he also, unlike the image of many Democrats, advocated tax cuts. We could say that he is one of the first supply side economic presidents, and that he said that if we cut taxes, we're actually going to improve everyone's life because the economy will grow because we create more jobs, and those jobs will create more economic activity, and so the overall um, tax rolls will increase. He said, quote, a rising tide raises all boats. All right, your first question. Number one, what are two different explanations given for why Kennedy couldn't get many of his actions passed? All right, well, he did actually raise the minimum wage, and he did pass a law that created a housing affairs department, and he was notorious for advocating women's rights. He developed a commission on the status of women. He had an act called the Equal Pay Act, which was passed through Congress, although he never actually offered a cabinet position to a woman. I think he had someone in charge of one of the bureaucratic agencies, at least, was headed by a woman, but earlier presidents had already done that. He also was a president who had a particular interest in intellectual disabilities. In your text, it calls it mental retardation, which is no longer a term that we use. How language changes quite quickly. Intellectual disabilities. And this led to many things, such as, after his administration, the creation of Special Olympics. A big legacy of Kennedy's short presidency is the Warren Court. And interestingly, it's named for Earl Warren, who is named as Chief Justice by his predecessor, Eisenhower, back in '53. And Eisenhower actually said that it was one of the worst moves he made during his presidency, but he only saw this after he was out of office and saw how Warren was Chief Justice. Other people would call Warren a great justice. He was just sort of divisive because the court was very activist, and it made a lot of decisions that delighted many people and angered others. One of the first, this is one of the less, well, it was divisive, was such things as redistricting. You know how we elect presidents according to the Electoral College. So each district gets a particular vote in the Electoral College, and those districts had been formed in like 1890, and since then they hadn't been redrawn, even though the population had been vastly different and differently located in now 1961, 62, compared to the way it had been much earlier. It couldn't have been 1890. Anyway, from much earlier. Anyway, many people had moved to the suburbs, many people had moved to the cities, and yet in comparing, in this particular court case that was heard, this one county in Tennessee, it was like one vote was worth I can't even remember, but one district was vastly underrepresented when you compared its population to a neighboring district. So the court basically decided that states had to redistrict, had to redraw their electoral districts based on population, and so we know why that was done. It was done because we want the Electoral College to, as much as we can, as much as possible, represent the popular vote, so that one person is basically deserving of one vote, so that one person's vote does not count more than another. It actually doesn't happen, but they could improve greatly. And so this is the first time the Supreme Court actually entered into a legislative decision that many people thought might better be decided by the legislature. And what it actually did was, even if it wasn't the court's primary purpose in doing this was to give more seats, more power to Democrats, because it actually counted cities and the suburbs more heavily than they had been. Actually, it was counting them more evenly than they had been because they had been undercounted previously. There were several cases that basically were about extending due process. Now, let me explain this. Um, uh, the Bill of Rights in the Constitution applies to federal laws. It doesn't apply overtly to state laws. Um, and some federal rights did not actually exist as written in state constitutions. But in the 14th Amendment, 4 amendments later after the Bill of Rights, um, the 14th Amendment says in part, because this was the amendment that basically enabled equal rights to ex-slaves and all people of color. It says in the 14th Amendment, in part, this is what the due process clause is called. No state, quote, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So basically, every person needs to be treated the same under our legal system and in courts of law. So there's many cases that came that the Supreme Court ruled on where they cited the 14th Amendment due process clause as their rationale, as their constitutional rationale for their decision. For example, first off, in 1961, Mapp versus Ohio, that state courts could not consider evidence obtained that was obtained in violation of the Constitution. In 1963, Gideon versus Wainwright, that any defendant in a criminal case had a right to an attorney, whether they could afford it or not. In 1964, Escobedo, versus Illinois, it reaffirmed the access to an attorney, and that they must be informed of their right to remain silent before they're questioned by the police. And adding to that, in 1966 was Miranda versus Arizona, which said that their right to remain silent and their other rights needed to be stated as they were being arrested, which you've seen on every cop show. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you can't say can and will be used against you in a court of law, blah, 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 blah. Those are called Miranda rights based on this Miranda versus Arizona. And because of this technicality, because this confession was made before he was given his rights, Miranda actually got off on what would have otherwise been a guilty verdict. And that brings us to question number 3. Did I give you question number 2? Oh my gosh, I didn't. So you're going to have to go back if you don't remember this. Number 2. What was the basic intent of the Supreme Court in requiring states to revise their electoral districts? Sorry, I didn't ask that earlier. What was the basic intent of the Supreme Court in requiring states to revise their electoral districts? And I want more than just a 2-word answer. But it doesn't have to be more than a, 5 or 6 or 7 word answer. More than 2 words, though. All right, and this, number 3, is what we just went over. What was the constitutional basis for these 4 cases that protected people accused of crimes? What was the constitutional basis for these 4 cases I just talked about of people accused of crimes? What was the constitutional argument? What did they go back to? All right, a couple more cases involving prayer. Engel versus Vitale and Abington versus Schempp, 62 and 63, that states could not compose prayers that had to be recited by children. And in Schempp, the court ruled against state-mandated Bible readings in public schools. Okay, you can't force a student to say a prayer. You can't force a student to recite Bible verses. And what was the reason for this? First Amendment. Okay, interesting. It's right to free speech, but also right to practice your own religion. There was no um, ability to, I hate to use the word because it has a terrible connotation, but indoctrinate anyone according to one faith or another. I know a lot of people think that this is actually anti-Christian, but you know what? We have the freedom to practice as we choose, and we can be Christian if we so choose, and we can have a lot of rights if we choose to do that. I know there's a lot of people out there that say, but it's becoming less and less free, and we won't get into that right now. All right, the New York Times reporter said, the Warren Court has brought more social change than just about every Congress or any president in U.S. history. I don't know about that last one, but Warren Court did do a lot. And many times people accuse them of being a very liberal court, even though Earl Warren was brought in by Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower. All right. Number 4. What was the constitutional basis for the cases protecting... Oh, I already did this. Forget that. Sorry about that. All right. Let's talk about the Cold War. Okay? Always a good topic. Now that it's in the past, we hope. Well, at least this era of the Cold War was. John Kennedy did agree that we needed to have nuclear weapons, but he also thought that Eisenhower did not retain the flexibility that a military needed to have with conventional forces. So he advocated building up a little bit with conventional forces, that is, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, you know. He wanted to use it in a lot of different ways, but let's talk about Latin America and what was going on there and what our policy was there. During this period in time, a lot of Latin American countries had been sort of taken over, the political power had been taken over by wealthy or aristocratic authoritarian thugs who basically tried to not only gain power but retain it and gain wealth and more power from that position as president. Often they were far to the right in their political persuasion, and we often supported them. Why? Because even if we didn't think that their democracies were working, because they were definitely not, we hated the alternative much worse, and that was left-leaning, possibly communist government. And so we supported these governments and these leaders. I mentioned last week about how we supported, for example, the Shah of Iran, who was no sweet cookie, but it was like better than the possible alternative. Well, I guess our government thought that this was a better alternative than, of course, communism, because we were really scared of communists and of countries going communist, especially in our own hemisphere. And so we not only used covert CIA aid, but outright economic aid to many countries in Latin America. Interestingly, in Cuba, it didn't really work. Cuba actually was quite prosperous, but it had a very crooked leader named Fulgencio Batista in the late 50s, who basically was lining his own pockets and had America in his pocket. Because as long as America could that is the United States, could invest more in Cuba, he got wealthy, the Americans got wealthy, and who didn't get wealthy? Well, just as in other places in Latin America, many of the people of the country, Cubans, were not getting wealthy. They were resentful of the influence of the United States, and they wanted change. And in Cuba, there was a revolution, as you probably know about, and that's when a guy named Fidel Castro came in and led a revolution. And after the fact, basically announced that he was a communist and allied himself very quickly with the Soviet Union so that he could get aid from the Soviet Union. And what would the Soviet Union love more than anything is a communist government 90 miles away from the shores of the United States. Um, and Fidel Castro established ties to the USSR. He instituted drastic land reform, not for the better, believe me. He seized foreign-owned businesses, which was awful. Um, Eisenhower actually had the CIA, before he left office, had the CIA train Cuban exiles in planning for an attack on Cuba that would then lead to a hoped for insurrection on the part of the people against Castro. Well, this invasion was carried out in the Kennedy administration, so Kennedy gets the primary blame for it. It was a disaster. Um, there was no success in this small invasion called the Bay of Pigs, and everyone who cooperated in it or who fought in it was either killed or captured. And it made the U.S. look weak against communism. Made us look um, inept, and it tarnished Kennedy's reputation, especially with Cubans. Just ask my Cuban wife. All right, and the other problem with Cuba is once it basically was under the regime of Castro, um, the Soviet Union, we discovered through satellite photos and I guess through reconnaissance planes, that the USSR had established long-range nuclear missiles on Cuban soil, on the northwest coast of Cuba, basically facing straight for the United States, for Florida and the south coast, and heck, it could probably go anywhere. Chicago, New York, Boston, Charlottesville. Um, anyway, so Kennedy basically, once he learned this, he set up a blockade. And during this whole thing, it's interesting because he had very little foreign policy experience. He actually talked a lot with former President Dwight Eisenhower and got his feedback on the situation. So it's sort of interesting of a sitting president, and I actually have to hand it to Kennedy for doing this, for pulling in Eisenhower as an advisor on this. So anyway, he created a blockade, and it was one of the tensest times because here the Soviet Union had missiles already set, aimed, ready to go, and we intercepted ships and we stopped them. And there was a tense standoff, and no one knew what would happen. Well, finally, the USSR and the United States did agree that the Soviet Union would not have nuclear weapons in Cuba, one for the U.S., but in return, we would basically remove our long-range nuclear missiles that were stationed in Turkey that were pointed at Moscow and the rest of the Soviet Union. And it did another thing that I can't remember. Oh, we also had to agree that we would not invade Cuba, which was a no duh. Of course we wouldn't invade Cuba. Well, some people say that this very good thing, the fact that the USSR stepped down and removed missiles from Cuba, in the end may have built up the arms race in the USSR because it gave Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, a bad name. He was replaced fairly quickly, and the USSR basically quickly tried to build up to keep pace with the nuclear arsenal of the U.S. You can't say that Kennedy had any foresight or was even thinking about the long-term possibility of what would happen politically and what they might decide in the future. He basically held firm, and again, as previous presidents had shown, the USSR did back down. In another situation, back to Berlin again, where it was divided into two zones, the free zone and the eastern unfree zone. Remember, all of the city of Berlin is in communist-held, Soviet-controlled East Germany. But there is this little enclave, half of it, which was free, the part that had been controlled by the Allies and which they never gave control of. Well, the Soviet Union hated the fact that many people tried to escape from East Berlin into Berlin, and so they finally, when they couldn't take Berlin without us rejecting that, they built a wall that separated the city of Berlin into East Berlin and West Berlin. And if people tried to escape from East Berlin to West Berlin, the free side, oftentimes they were shot by guards who were posted 24/7 on the wall. So when you see films of President Reagan standing in front of the wall, that's the Berlin Wall, and he famously said, Mr. Gorbachev, who was leader at the time, take down this wall, or tear down this wall, which Gorbachev did. The last, well, of that era, communist leader who would try to open up the West, the East to the West. But that's getting off our point. In November of 1963, just a little over a year and a half after Kennedy became president, he actually was assassinated. You probably know that, by a sniper in Dallas. Lee Harvey Oswald. If you go to Dallas, you can see the place. There was much controversy about this because only a couple days after he was taken into custody, Lee Harvey Oswald was also shot by a guy named Jack Ruby. And some people think that there might have been a conspiracy involved and that Lee Harvey Oswald was being silenced, killed, in order to keep him silent about a larger conspiracy. Some people say it was a communist conspiracy. Other people say it was a mob conspiracy, a mafia conspiracy. In the end, the Warren Commission, yes, one that was headed by Earl Warren, basically concluded that there was no evidence that there was collusion in this. They concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But there's still lots of theories and ideas, and I don't know if anyone is completely convinced. All right, so who came on then? Well, we know what succession is. We know that if Kennedy is killed, I'm saying it with a smile. When Kennedy was killed, it was his vice president who immediately became president, and that was Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was from Texas and was the consummate politician. What else did I want to say? I turned the page too early. Sorry about that. Johnson takes over. Okay, consummate politician. He had been in the Congress as a congressman. He had been in the Senate as a senator. He was the Senate Majority Leader in the Senate, so he had lots of experience. Like, what did your text say? Like, almost 30 years of experience in Congress, in either the House or in the Senate. And his personality was such that he was a schmoozer. So he could basically try to find consensus very well. And what he said he wanted to do, and which he did very effectively, was he wanted to put Johnson's agenda into law. Now remember, Kennedy's agenda into law. Now remember, Kennedy hadn't been able to pass much of his things while Johnson saw them and many more things through. For example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, both protecting the minorities, primarily Black Americans, right to vote without interference, were both passed. And he did 60 programs that he passed through Congress, including important ones like Medicare, which is exactly the thing that John F. Kennedy tried to get, which is health insurance for the elderly, which we still have today. And he extended that in a program called Medicaid, which is medical insurance covering people who are below the poverty threshold. He also created something, I didn't say this, but Kennedy had created the Peace Corps. You probably remember that. And Johnson created something called VISTA, which was sort of the domestic version of the Peace Corps. Johnson also instituted Upward Bound. I don't know if you've heard of it, but a great program that has high schoolers helping people who have less opportunity and maybe lower achievement, who are their peers, to bring them up to grade level in academic subjects. He also started Head Start, which is a a publicly funded preschool, so that people, a lot of research had been coming out showing that much learning is done before school even starts. Duh. And so we needed to actually take people who were falling through the safety net and who weren't getting proper education at home for various reasons, much of them socioeconomic poverty, and actually have a federally funded preschool for them called Head Start, which still exists. And he basically extended the urban affairs program of Kennedy, and he created a cabinet level department called the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And the secretary of that is a cabinet level member. He also passed the Immigration Act, which eliminated that horrible national origin system that had eliminated widespread immigration and favored Northwest Europeans. Now people from anywhere in the world could come. He also, well, his program overall is called the Great Society Program. And it's his lasting legacy of many social programs. And the question is, was it successful? And it's hard to calculate because it's hard to quantify. His aims were very idealistic and very big, and there wasn't, of course, enough money to be able to fully realize any of these programs. And also, a thing that we haven't talked about, the Vietnam War was consuming more and more attention and more money in the U.S. economy, in the U.S. Federal budget than it had previously. So all these things may have compromised Johnson's Great Society program. So number 5, your question is, was Lyndon Johnson or John Kennedy a more effective president? And why? Was Lyndon Johnson or John Kennedy a more effective president, and why? I think I made that pretty simple. And you know what? That's going to be it. Okay, watch for emails. We'll have a final class on Zoom, and we'll try that format. And hope we don't say, oh, wow, we should have done that all along, because I spent a lot of time doing these videos. Bye.